There once was a shepherd in the Ethiopian mountains. He was out in the field with his goats one day when they suddenly started to act very strangely. It looked as if the goats were dancing. The shepherd noticed that his flock nibbled on the bright red berries of a certain glossy green bush with fragrant blossoms, so he chewed on the fruits himself. Exhilarated, he brought the berries to an Islamic holy man in a nearby monastery. But the holy man disapproved of their use and threw them into the fire, from which an enticing aroma billowed in the monastery. The roasted beans were quickly raked from the embers, ground up and dissolved in hot water, yielding the world's first cup of coffee. At least that's how the legend goes. Indeed, coffee is believed to originate from Ethiopia, and goats are often used to clear out weeds and other unknown plants. So a goat herder is a likely candidate for the first person who stumbled upon the first coffee plant. But the people who discovered coffee didn't start brewing it right away. In the beginning, people just ate the berries themselves, cooked them in porridge, fermented them as wine, or mixed them in with fat and compressed them into some kind of caffeinated lunch bar. But later, when the Ethiopians introduced coffee to Yemen, it attracted the attention of Sufis, Islamic mystics who were quite an expert in experimenting with new substances. And they became obsessed with brewing coffee because it helped them stay awake for their most important prayers, which happened late into the night. And it worked. So how does coffee actually help you stay awake? You see, the reason why you feel sleepy comes down to a chemical named adenosine. During physical work or intense brain activity, adenosine is released. It attaches to adenosine receptors in your brain, and slowly your muscles start to loosen up and your neurons start to lose their pace. This makes you tired, and eventually you become incapable of staying awake. Now, here is where coffee comes in. The caffeine in coffee has a similar chemical structure to adenosine. And when we drink coffee, it's the caffeine that sticks to the adenosine receptors in your brain, blocking out the adenosine itself. But when caffeine sticks to these receptors, it doesn't actually activate them. So you won't feel drowsy, you'll be less tired. Some of these adenosine receptors also have a receptor for dopamine, the pleasure chemical. When adenosine takes its place in the receptor, there is no more room for dopamine. But when caffeine replaces adenosine, the dopamine can still attach itself to the receptor. This results in you experiencing more pleasure, and it's also why coffee is chemically addictive. Far more addictive substances like sugar and cocaine basically open a floodgate of dopamine to the brain. Caffeine also increases your adrenaline, the well-known fight or flight hormone that aids you with a sudden burst of energy. Adrenaline increases your heartbeats and blood pressure and expands your airways. As scary as this effect might seem, it's not a cause for concern. As a matter of fact, studies link coffee with a decrease in the risk of vascular diseases and an improvement in athletic abilities. Caffeine was believed to give athletes such an unfair advantage that for 32 years, athletes in the Olympics were prohibited from having too much caffeine in their bloodstream. So more adrenaline, more dopamine, and less functioning adenosine, the combination of these chemical effects stimulates the brain and increases focus. In fact, drinking coffee might improve cognitive performance when it comes to memory. And caffeine in low doses has a similar effect on bees. There is a very small concentration of caffeine in pollen, which, when consumed by bees, improves their ability to map and remember the location of the plant. It was these effects, and not necessarily the taste, that led to the rapid spread of coffee, first in the Middle East and later in Europe. In fact, many historians believe that it was the surge in the popularity of coffee that led to the Age of Enlightenment. This brain-stimulating drink not only replaced depressant beverages such as beer and wine, but also the place where coffee was served, the coffee houses, became a new secular place of gathering. Poets, intellectuals, and freethinkers alike met and debated in these coffee houses. And throughout history, from London to Istanbul, rulers who didn't like the free political discourse taking place in these coffee houses started outright banning them. Although it took a few hurdles for coffee to become so popular. Initially, Europeans looked at this Islamic drug with suspicion. It took the Pope himself to perform what historians debate was either a baptism or an outright exorcism on the coffee beans for coffee to become accepted and for the first coffee houses to open in Europe. But when they did, they were a hit, and people like Rousseau, Kierkegaard, Bach, Beethoven and Voltaire, who drank upwards of 40 cups of coffee per day, became its biggest fans. Now, having praised the hell out of coffee, please do allow me to stress this point. Do not drink 40 cups of coffee in one day. Let's not forget that caffeine is inherently a pesticide. The reason there is so much caffeine in the coffee plant in the first place is to protect the plant from insects by killing them. And even though you're far larger than an insect, with enough caffeine, you could share the same fate. The lethal amount of caffeine for the average adult is somewhere between 10 to 15 grams of caffeine, which is about 50 to 70 cups of coffee. Now, the reason that Voltaire was still alive and sound of mind, perhaps debatably so, after drinking so many cups, is because the caffeine was leaving his body faster than it was getting in. You would need to drink 70 cups back to back at such an incredible rate that before you overdose, you'd probably choke. But if you ever tried this with caffeine pills, don't, cause that will kill you. And it's probably gonna be a horrible way to go with all the anxiety and hallucinations you'll be getting up until the last moment. Contrary to popular belief, drinking coffee doesn't actually have any downsides on your long-term health. In fact, coffee is linked with a lowered risk of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. But that doesn't mean that the more you drink, the healthier you'll become. Rather, you should look at coffee as a potion that will be more effective the less you have it. You see, your brain isn't a fool, and it knows when it's being tricked to stay awake for longer. Over time, the more coffee you drink, the more adenosine receptors will be produced by your brain. So you'd need more coffee to get the same effect as before. And if you cut cold turkey, you would suffer from symptoms of excessive tiredness, headache, and nausea. But eventually, between 2 to 9 days, these temporary adenosine receptors will disappear. Then you can have a cup of coffee again and get the same feeling that you did the first time you tried it. And lastly, you should be mindful of when to drink. Coffee has a 6-hour half-life. That means after 6 hours of consuming caffeine, half of it will still be left in your system. It means if you had 2 cups of coffee at 6 in the evening, it's just like drinking 1 cup of coffee at midnight. Drinking 1 cup of coffee per day, an hour after you wake up, between the hours of 9 to 12, seems to be the key at unlocking the true potentials of this powerful potion, without suffering any of its downsides. So, feel free to drink it however you like, as latte, mocha, Turkish or espresso, with sugar or without. Just do so in moderation.